Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us at this evening's UCD Institute of Food and Health Public Health Lecture Series. We're delighted that you can join us this evening. This series of lectures are designed to give you, the public, an expert opinion in areas in the area of food and health that are of interest to you, providing you with the expert knowledge from our scientists within the Institute of Food and Health, and also experts joining us from external to the university as well. So tonight we have the important topic of a healthy school lunch. So I'm sure those of you who are joining in are often challenged as to what to put into your child's school lunch box. So tonight I am delighted that Dr. Celine Murrin is going to share with us her expert opinion in this topic. So Celine Murrin is a lecturer or assistant professor in public health nutrition, and Celine is the deputy director of the National Nutrition Surveillance Centre. She has over 15 years experience in researching what influences children's diet and food behaviour, including the evaluation of school food programmes in Ireland. Now, Celine is going to share with us her thoughts via some slides and a presentation. And then at the end of this period, we're going to have a question and answer session. So you can pose your questions in the Q&A tab on the Zoom link that you have. And for the question and answer session, we're going to be joined by Dr. Sarah Brown, who's a registered dietitian and assistant professor in clinical nutrition and dietetics. And Sarah has over 17 years experience in conducting dietetic clinics and community healthy promotion work, and again, specialising in youth programmes and education. We'll also be joined by Niamh Landy, who has over 17 years work experience as a paediatric dietitian. She has worked in Great Ormond Street Hospital in London and in CHI Temple Street also. In October 2022, she joined our MSc in Nutrition and Dietetics team, and she will be delighted this evening to share her expertise also in the panel Q&A session. So during the course of the talk, keep posing your questions. You'll be hearing the talk live, obviously, but a recording of the talk and the slides that Celine will present will also be available to you via the UCD Institute of Food and Health website. So over to you, Celine. Thank you very much.
Sorry, many thanks, Dolores, and good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you this evening about healthy school lunches. So first of all, just to give you a little bit of an overview of the presentation this evening. So I'm just getting my slides sorted here. Apologies now, this is just getting my slides to move on. Here we go. So just to give you an overview of the presentation this evening, I'm broadly going to talk about three topics. So the first one is just talking about healthy eating in general and some of the lunchbox food and the types of healthy eating tips that might be useful for you. Secondly, then, to introduce the whole area of children's diets in Ireland and to reflect on some of the research that's been conducted to really understand children's diets, and I suppose looking at the area of children's lunchboxes. And then I'm just going to focus on really looking at other research that has looked at, well, what is really influencing children's food behaviour, and also to try and look at the bigger picture in relation to how do we actually broadly influence the types of food that we are bringing into schools. So I think for most people that are probably joining this evening, you're obviously very interested in children's lunchboxes. I suppose a disclaimer here in that there is no magic solution in trying to create children's lunchboxes, and we know that it can be a really challenging area for parents. But I suppose from a nutrition perspective, the importance of lunchtime and children's lunches during their day is really important because they consume about a third to a half of their energy from the lunches and the breaks that they have in school. Also, school lunches are really important from a nutrition perspective because they can actually improve the overall diet quality. So it means that because children are spending so much time in school during the day, we can introduce different types and ranges of food as part of that lunchtime meal experience. But also another area that is really important for children is this idea of food behavior. And lunchtime, the consumption of food during lunchtime can be really considered as a behavior, in the sense that children are learning about food. They're learning about not only just the nutrition and the health aspects of food, but also how to manage their intake, how to learn about, well, what makes me feel hungry, what makes me feel satisfied, and also in terms of, even particularly with younger children, learning about how to consume food in a way that is meaningful for them. So whether it's looking at small portion sizes, looking at the colors of foods, things that make it more appealing for children to continue that practice later in life. And we know that children's food behaviors really are set down quite early in life. So the earlier we can introduce different types of food, the better it is for children in terms of improving their overall food behavior and therefore their nutritional quality of their food. So broadly, again, from a nutrition perspective, what we're trying to do with helping children to eat more healthily is to try and incorporate the different types of nutrients in our diet. And we have 6 broad nutrients. We have the macronutrients. Those are the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and they're what really overall can provide our energy from our food, but they also have lots of other different functions that are really important. Then we have vitamins and minerals, which are considered to be the micronutrients. And again, combined with the macronutrients, they help to release energy from food, but they're also really important in for instance, development of hormones and release and control of hormones. Obviously, from a nutrition perspective, we're using nutrition to really boost and to help our immune system so it can protect children from diseases. And not just diseases in childhood, but these are diseases that may occur later in life as well. But also, nutrition is really important for children because they are growing and because they are developing those neural pathways within their brains and the neural system. So overall, the importance of nutrition is really critical. And so trying to incorporate these various nutrients in our diet is really important during childhood. And obviously, this can be really complicated. This is an area of research that is, constantly being updated, being reviewed. But the basics of nutrition have not really changed in terms of our understanding of the types of foods that we are or should be consuming. And essentially, in order for you to get all of the correct amounts of nutrients, what we always default to in Ireland is the food pyramid. And so you're all probably familiar with this concept or the messaging behind the food pyramid. But what really it's telling us is that in order for us to get all of those nutrients, we need to be consuming a range and a variety of different types of foods every day. The bulk of our food intake should be consumed with a large number of portions of fruits and vegetables. So again, depending on the age group, but between 5 to 7. We also need to get lots of different nutrients from things like wholemeal cereals, breads, potatoes, pasta, and rice. We also need to get other nutrients from our milk, yogurts, and cheese. And then we need to have protein in our diet, and we can get our protein from things like meat, poultry, fish, eggs, beans, and nuts, in addition to other types of vitamins and minerals. And then finally, we will tend to incorporate different types of fats, spreads, and oils. Some of these can be really beneficial from our diet, but we need to consume those in moderate amounts. And at the very top of this shelf, you'll see that there is what are considered as the discretionary types of foods. And these are the foods that we really shouldn't be consuming every day. They can be eaten on occasion. And they're the ones that typically tend to have foods that are high in fat and sugar and salt. So they really should be eaten on an occasional types of basis. So the food pyramid is really a guide to help us understand, well, what types of food should we be consuming, the amounts of foods that we should be consuming, and in what types of proportions overall in our diet. And if, again, some of you may be familiar with this, but the HSE have developed some really nice tools to help parents and to help all different segments of the population to have some understanding of, well, what does that look like for my lifestyle or for my diet? And so this is an example of a 5-year-old boy. It shows you then for this particular boy, he's quite active, and he really needs to have, again, about 5 to 7 portions of fruit and vegetables. He needs to have about 3 to 5 portions of cereals, breads and pastas, 3 portions of milk, yogurt and cheese, 2 of meat, poultry, fish, eggs, beans or nuts, and then in very small amounts of the remaining two shelves. And they also give you a nice menu plan. So if you're looking at just the lunch type of items that they're giving or recommending, they've suggested here a wholemeal pita bread, some sweet corn, some lettuce, and with some tuna. So they're getting various different types of nutrients. You can see the shelves that they represent here, that is providing those with the appropriate type of nutrition. They've also suggested then a snack. So a mid-morning snack would be some grapes, and then maybe an afternoon snack would be a yogurt type of product. And then for older children, so this is again a 10-year-old active girl. Broadly speaking, they're the same in terms of the recommendations, except for something like milk and yogurt and cheese. And you can see the recommendations are increased slightly for different age groups. And that again is to do with the developmental phase that they are in. They are growing at a rapid rate in terms of developing bone density. And so that's where they may need some additional nutrients from those sources. And again, they give you some nice examples here of the type of lunch that would be appropriate for that particular age group. And again, additions in terms of the snacks and where to incorporate those additional portions of milk, yogurt and cheese. So these are some really nice resources that are provided and are available on the link below in terms of the HSE website. And they, again, it's not just for children, they actually have it for adults and for older adults as well. So for different ages in the population. So what are we really trying to incorporate as part of our overall school lunches? Well, the key message when it comes to school lunches is really trying to include a variety of foods. And that is important because it's not only providing you with lots of different types of nutrients, it's also important because it's trying to open up the different sensory properties of foods to children, because we know children can be reticent to try new foods. And so it's really important to try and encourage them to try lots of different types of foods. There doesn't have to be a huge amount of them, but just to try and get their sensory, their senses adjusted and to adapt to different types of flavors, different types of textures, because they will learn, in most cases, they will learn to adopt new food preferences over time, and it can take a considerable amount of time. So overall, what we're trying to then include is not only a variety, but in our lunch boxes, we should be trying to include fruit and vegetables of some type of variety. We need to be including some type of starchy foods, or those energy, cereals, breads, potatoes. We need to try and incorporate a type of protein food and also some dairy foods. And obviously, we should be providing them with some type of fluid. And we would strongly recommend that it is milk or water are the best options in terms of fluid intake for children. So what does that look like then specifically? If you're looking at fruit and vegetable intakes, and I'm sure you've heard the messages around taste the rainbow. And the reason for that is that idea of the variety of fruits and vegetables that can provide a huge array of particularly the micronutrients. So it's particularly vitamins and minerals that we really are benefiting from when we're consuming lots of different types of fruits and vegetables, but we're also getting lots of really good fiber, which is really important for our diet and for children's diets. So the type of recommendations for children would be to try and have at least 1 serving in a lunchbox, but aim for maybe trying to have at least a serving of a fruit or vegetable during their little break, and maybe during a big break to have at least 1 fruit, and maybe if you can incorporate a vegetable as well as part of that big break snack. The types of things that we're looking for in terms of fruit in portion sizes would be an apple, an orange, banana, maybe 2 smaller fruits, so that'd be something like plums or kiwis or mandarin, and then maybe a small bunch of grapes. So any of these would be really good options as part of a school lunch. And then in terms of vegetables, and this tends to be the one that's much harder to encourage children to consume, but even putting a little bit of lettuce as part of a sandwich, or in trying to incorporate maybe baby tomatoes or maybe a little bit of cucumber or celery sticks or chopped carrots, any of those are really, really nice ways of starting to introduce the vegetables as part of a normal lunchtime routine. And then options, again, also particularly in the winter time, would be things like homemade vegetable soup for children. We don't necessarily encourage smoothies. And a lot of that is just because when particularly smoothies that have been made up as part of a pre-packaged type of smoothie, because they tend to lose a lot of the fiber that you would typically associate with fruits that are really important. And it also means that the sugar content of those smoothies is readily accessible. So it means that the children don't necessarily digest the fruit, which releases the sugar much more slowly. Whereas in the smoothies, it's more like a sugar type of beverage. So trying to encourage vegetables, we know, is really challenging for parents, particularly with some children. And so the idea is really to try and recognize that children don't necessarily like the taste of vegetables, primarily because they're not sweet. So they will always default to fruit because it is a sweeter product. Vegetables tend to have much stronger flavors, and also they tend to be harder in texture a lot of the time. And so some children, find it difficult maybe to chew them initially when they're smaller, and then maybe they don't get used to the flavor and the taste of vegetables. So the idea is to really start introducing vegetables slowly. Don't try and expect miracles. Small little tiny pieces of vegetables incorporated in the lunch can really start to build up that exposure that children really need to trust the food. And that's essentially what we're trying to build up, that experience of children. Trying again to include different types of colors at all possible. And if you can, and I know parents, you're busy enough, but trying to, peel and chop and slice vegetables can be problematic at 7:30 in the morning. But if you can, try and do it in advance if at all possible. If your children are older, you could get them involved in trying to, prepare those types of lunches. And again, if necessary, try and maybe include something like a dip that can just make it a little bit more appealing for the child, just to adapt to the taste of the vegetable. And then they can slowly build up the trust of the vegetable by liking then the taste. So we know that for children, you need to be really repeatedly exposing them to different types of flavors and textures. And again, this can be over 20 exposures that might be necessary in order for a child to even get to that point of wanting to consume a particular food. And again, this can work for some children. It may not work for other children, and other children may have particular sensory challenges that they find it really difficult to overcome those types of preferences for different types of foods. In terms then of the whole grains, what we really are looking for then is the trying to encourage fiber into children's diets, as well as a good source of energy overall. And so what we'd suggest as well for whole grain is to try and replace the white bread if you possibly can for whole grain. And again, maybe it's trying to introduce it maybe once a week and slowly build up the preference for whole grain over a longer period. Again, look, swapping out crackers, refined crackers, for maybe a whole grain type of cracker. And again, if you're using things like rice, if you're providing that in lunches, to use the brown variety. Again, for some schools, this isn't necessarily an issue in terms of bringing crisps to school, but if that is something that is part of a routine or is the norm in schools, maybe switch out the crisps for popcorn instead is a better option. And again, a low salt variety would be better again. Just be aware of some of the bread products. I mean, we would try and encourage you to use different types of bread if at all possible. Give children an opportunity to try different types of whether it's a wrap, whether it's breadsticks, whether it's bagels or wholemeal slices of bread. But again, just remember, particularly for older children, when they tend to get more hungry and they do demand more, just being aware that, for instance, in terms of calorie content, that you have Wraps can be a little bit more energy dense than a regular sliced bread. So, one wrap would be the equivalent of 2 slices of bread. And similarly, 1 pita bread would be the equivalent slices of 2 bread. And a baguette or a demi-baguette would be the equivalent of about 4 slices of bread. So just that you're aware of the different energy contributions that these types of breads are making as well. In terms of our protein content, what we're looking for is, a lot of people will automatically be used to having the kind of cooked meat. So whether that's ham, chicken, turkey as part of a sandwich. Again, chicken and turkey can sometimes be better options just because they often tend to have lower salt content, but be careful of the types of products that you're looking for. So again, a lot of them you find that it's, cooked chicken breast, which can be really nice. And there's very little in terms of added salt or flavorings to those. Things like lentils, beans are really nice options as well in terms of introducing protein, or maybe you have something like tuna fish, maybe that can be included as part of a sandwich. The guide in terms of a protein content is around the portion, a size of the portion of the palm of your hand. And that, remember, is your child's hand, not necessarily your hand. So think about the quantity that you're providing for your children in their lunch and what's manageable, particularly for different age groups. And I know particularly if you're preparing lunches for different ages of children, it can be really difficult to tailor different sizes, but do bear that in mind. If you have a 10-year-old, the amount that they're going to need is quite different than from a 4 or 5-year-old as well. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at the portion sizes. Then in terms of our dairy content, again, as I've mentioned, it's really important, and particularly older children do need greater number of portions of dairy intake. And this can be in terms of milk. I know some schools may be still participating in the school milk scheme. Yogurts can also be a really important source in terms of dairy. Again, trying to look for maybe the low fat and the low sugar options. Again, be careful in terms of looking at labels to make sure that just because they're low in fat doesn't necessarily mean that they're low in sugar. So maybe to have a look at some of those labels. So low in fat would mean up to 3 grams per 100 grams, and low in sugar would be up to 9 grams per 100 grams. And trying to avoid the yogurts that tend to, I suppose, the yogurts that the children automatically default to. So that's the one with the crumbles or with the chocolate bits, or, all of those things that are essentially designed to make children actually want to consume them. So trying to keep it more like regular style yogurts. And then with cheese, we don't need a huge amount of cheese, but we certainly need cheese. It's a really important source of calcium. And so looking at the portion size here, there's 2 options. You can look at it like the wedge that is between 2 thumbs put together, or this is another option here, which gives you more types of portion sizes. So looking at the 2, your forefinger and your index finger together would be what would a portion of cheese in terms of children. And again, you're using the child's finger as opposed to an adult sized finger. So just in terms of looking at children's, it's all well and good me telling you that these are the types of foods that children are consuming, but the challenge is often then, well, how do we actually get them to eat those types of foods? And what the research has shown is, from a parenting perspective, is that we have to strike a balance between how we're encouraging and how we're supporting children in making healthier choices. And what the evidence is showing us is that parents who tend to promote a balanced food intake, including variety, and that's not just necessarily in the healthy food choices, but it's also saying to children that, well, you can try different types of foods and knowing when is enough. So it's really making sure that children recognize that, yes, you can have that pizza, but you can't have pizza every day. Or yes, you can have that packet of crisps, but you can't have a packet of crisps every day. So it's making sure that children try foods, that they recognize that these foods are plenty and they're available. Unfortunately, we can't protect children from all of the foods that are out there that may not be as good for their health. But it's important that they know and learn what is food that is useful and good for them to eat, and foods that they can eat plenty of, such as fruit and vegetables, but foods then that they really shouldn't be eating very often. Also, the other note that's been made from the literature and from the research is that if parents make healthy foods available at home, so don't restrict fruits and vegetables, allow children to consume them. And again, this can be challenging, particularly when it's coming up to meal times and children are hungry. Offering them maybe certain types of small amounts of fruits or vegetables just to kind of satiate them and to keep their hunger at bay can be useful to, again, get them used to those flavors, but also may not necessarily fill them up as much when they're eating their dinner. Trying to encourage children in meal planning and preparation, but also critically, and you'll see this again, is that parents need to be visible eating healthily with their children as well. So children need to see their parents eating the apple, eating the carrots, eating the tomatoes or whatever it might be. That's who they see, particularly for younger children, that their parents are really important role models as healthy eaters. And also talking about nutrition and talking about healthy eating is important, not as a teaching lesson, but as a way of just building it in as part of when you're preparing meals, that you're talking about different types of foods and saying, isn't this really good? This is a really important food because it gives you lots of different types of vitamins. So it's trying to build in that awareness and knowledge for children around nutrition and healthy eating as part of a normal experience and normal food behaviors. What we know from also from evidence looking at parents in terms of trying to encourage children to eat healthily is that the sort of old-fashioned way of trying to cajole or threaten or persuade children to consume your vegetables, for instance, doesn't work. So that, threat that we all may have experienced as children, that you have to sit at the table until you finish your dinner, or you have to sit at the table, or you won't get dessert unless you eat your vegetables. These types of strategies really don't work. They end up being a power struggle with parents and children, and it ends up being quite a negative experience overall around meal times for parents and children. And that again sets up a sort of a precedent for children then, in relation to trying to encourage a healthy consumption at the table. It can be really, really difficult. As we said before, children do need to try and see and try new foods regularly before they'll accept them. Again, before you try something new in a lunchbox, I'd suggest that you try new foods at home first. So if you can encourage them to try something new, maybe, providing them with a reward, but a reward that's not a food is the best option. So whether it's maybe a sticker, or maybe you say, that they get to do something different or something out of the ordinary by trying different types of foods, not just vegetables, but lots of different types of foods, that maybe that there is a benefit for them at the end of it. As I said before, really do start with small amounts, and remembering, what you're able to eat as an adult is very different in terms of, particularly for smaller children. So managing small amounts is really important for younger children in particular. Again, if they don't eat the food, and particularly when it comes to lunch boxes as well, you often see them coming home with the same food that has gone into the lunchbox. And I suppose the challenge is not to make a big fuss about it. It may be that you just have to try again, maybe in a few weeks, try the food that you were trying to encourage them to eat, and maybe try it in a little bit later on. I've talked already about modeling. It's important that parents have to eat the food. And again, trying new foods, trying foods that maybe that's something that's you normally wouldn't consume, but as a family that your children are seeing that different types of foods are being brought into your house. And maybe it's a different spice, or maybe it's some other type of different food from a different country that you've never tried before, but you make that as part of it, lets everybody try it and see. And it doesn't matter if you don't like it, but the point is you're trying it and you're seeing that, okay, this tastes different, and what does it taste like, and trying to talk children through that. Trying to use opportunities that are available in the school, that can often be a good time to try something a little bit different. So there may be events around healthy eating, or around food, or around growing food, and that can be a really nice opportunity to do something different. But also, this is a slow process. Trying to encourage children to eat different foods can be really difficult, and so it can take quite a considerable length of time. There's lots of of good resources available. This is just one in particular from Safe Food, and that's available on their website. I'll have links to some of these at the end, but they provide really nice meal planners for healthy lunch boxes and can give you some really nice ideas about what to include, the portion size to include, and the variety of how to mix it up for your children as well. So the reason why we're interested in consuming, in encouraging children to eat healthy lunches is because in Ireland, we are still, not making the recommendations. We're not meeting our recommendations in terms of our children, our child population. We know that milk in particular is one that's cause for concern, and that we're seeing children are not consuming the milk, the recommended consumption of milk. And we also have seen that as part of work that we've done in the school milk schemes, that the consumption or the participation in school milk schemes is declining. And so, this can pose problems for children later in life if they're not actually obtaining enough nutrients from milk as part of a normal everyday diet. In terms of our protein content, we tend to get a lot of protein in Irish diet. We're not necessarily concerned about the quantity of protein, but it's the quality of the protein sources that we're getting can be a little bit problematic. We're seeing maybe a little bit too much in terms of the processed meat. And by what I mean by that is maybe the meat types that are maybe a little bit higher in salt. Some of them can have maybe added sugars, and it's not, and some of them can maybe have a little bit too much fat as part of that protein source. Rather than the type of lean meats or pulses like beans, we don't see as much of those being consumed by Irish children. In terms of our cereals, breads, and grains shelf, we know that we're very much consuming more white goods than whole grains, so we need to try and encourage children to consume more of those. And again, with our fruits and vegetables, we're not necessarily seeing children eating the recommendation in terms of our fruit and vegetables. And that's where the school lunch boxes can be a really good opportunity to encourage children to build those in as part of a regular daily routine. And what that leads to overall in terms of children's nutrient intake is that we can see 37% of Irish children have inadequate calcium, 94% have inadequate vitamin D, and this is not just from diet, this is from exposure in terms of sunlight as well. 20% have inadequate iron, and 30% have inadequate folate, which is a B vitamin. So we really need to do better in terms of how do we encourage and how do we support children in consuming better in terms of their dietary intake. I also just want to comment as well on our food pyramid and this concept of around the top shelf and those foods that are very much high in fat, sugar, and salt. And we often call these the treat foods. So these are things like our sweets, chocolate, cereal bars, crisps, etc. And what we know from an Irish perspective is that we're seeing a very large consumption of these types of foods in children's diets. So we see that 20% of children's energy intake in 2 to 4-year-olds is coming from these types of treat foods. And in older children, we're seeing up to a quarter of their energy is coming from these top shelf treat foods. And bear in mind that these are foods that really shouldn't be consumed every day. So this is an area that is very much, it can be problematic because we know that it's very difficult once children are used to these types of foods and they like the taste of them. Children innately have a preference for sweet, fatty foods. They build up a taste preference for salt foods. And so it can be really difficult in terms of managing the amount of foods that these types of products are given. And in general, we talk about these as treat foods. And we did some work looking at this concept of treat, which most people would associate with something that's very nice. So these are respondents from parents, grandparents, childminders, people working in education. And most people do see a treat food over on the left there as something that's nice. So we can all recognize what that might mean. But then we start seeing a little bit of difference in the sense that we see with education practitioners, so maybe that's teachers or preschool carers. They see that as the treat as being something that must be earned, whereas you see with maybe childminders or grandparents, it's less so that it's actually earned. So people have various different recognition and understanding of what a treat food actually means and different uses for what we describe as a treat food. And also then we can see that for some people, the treat is actually, not only is it a celebration, so again, many years ago, it would have been an occasional type of food that was being offered as part of a birthday party for an Easter, whereas now we're seeing that a treat is really very much part of a structure. It's part of a daily or a weekly structure. So we all know about Treat Fridays, but also it can be very built into the school lunches as well. And we, we've seen that as very much part of the types of foods that are being consumed within children's lunches. And you can see that again from research, again conducted in Ireland from the IUNA group. And this was really reporting on where we're seeing treat foods being consumed for children. And you can see the morning snack and the lunchtime is where we're observing that these types of treat foods are being consumed. So they are very much part of school lunches. Other research that has been done internationally, for instance, in Australia, they have looked at discretionary or treat foods, and they're saying that on average, children are consuming about 3 servings of treat foods in their lunch boxes. And similarly in the UK, about 50 to 60% of children's lunch boxes had sweet and savoury snack type or treat type of food. And in a study in the Northern Ireland, only 14% of lunch boxes actually had a piece of fruit. So it's trying to recognise that this is something that's become normal. It's not something that's occasional anymore. And we really need to start considering how do we maybe wean children off that habit of having to have a treat food during all of these eating occasions, because all of these eating occasions are building up together to form, these kind of excess in terms of fat, sugar, and energy and calorie intake for children. There was an interesting paper published relatively recently, and again, looking at what parents want to tell us about their experiences and perception of school lunches and what that feels like. And again, I'm sure some of this will be be recognizable for parents overall. So what they were telling us was that the child themselves, a lot of the reasons for their lunch type of choices was due to the child's preference. So that the children express their preferences for certain types of foods, and the parents would prefer if they were actually eating any food or unhealthy food rather than nothing at all. So that means that parents tend to pack foods only that they know that their children will eat. Also, if the child is a decision maker, and we encourage children to be decision makers as part of their lunch, but often the child is going to default to the unhealthier variety. And so it ends up being a negotiation. And usually one of the big reasons is that they see other children consuming the less healthy options. And so they don't want to feel excluded. They want to feel part of that peer experience. And so that can be, problematic in terms of trying to encourage children to consume something different to their peers. There's lots of influencing factors that are influencing parents. They certainly see the lunch as really important source of energy for children. And so people, there's a recognition that it's really important for children to have a good lunch for their mental energy, so it helps them with concentration, also their physical energy, and particularly if they're doing any sports during school or after school. So that importance of having a good lunch is really important for parents. But also they are really influenced by convenience. And we all know this, the time it takes to prepare a lunch, how easy it is to actually pack the lunch food. If it becomes inconvenient, well, then people are going to consume, choose more convenient options. So we need to be able to try and make this more convenient for parents. But also parents, in some instances, like to see their children having a good lunch experience. They want to imagine their children in school opening their lunchbox and going, isn't this a really lovely lunch that my mum or my dad or my minder packed for me? They want it to be something that children look forward to. And that's where we get into this area of packing a treat, because we know children will respond really positively to that. But there's also other options, that if we can make lunch maybe a little bit different or a little bit more interesting, that element of play that can be built into it can be really important. But again, parents like to have children thinking about home and thinking about this nice lunch that was made for me by, my minder or my guardian, that it builds that connection. And so parents like having that connection. But we also know the school environment has a huge role to play. Lunchtime duration is one thing that we know and recognize, that sometimes children just don't get enough lunchtime to consume their foods. And so parents will change the types of foods that they're consuming to make it more convenient for the child. They'll reduce the portions in some instances. They'll exclude fruit. They haven't even mentioned vegetables, but they'll exclude fruit because it takes longer for children to consume. And also we know that there's lots of regulations in school that will, in positive, but maybe sometimes negative reasons, that they may restrict certain types of food. So whether that's allergy policies or healthy eating policies, and oftentimes parents make their own decisions around whether to adhere to these policies, and particularly if they're not being monitored. And also we obviously have food safety concerns. Parents might be concerned about certain food items sitting in a lunchbox all day, and a school bag. And so they may limit the types of foods, and maybe it's more packaged foods rather than fresh foods that they're including in children's lunch boxes. And for other parents, it can be really challenging in terms of trying to manage the cost of healthy eating. And we know that particularly if children are not going to consume a certain food, that parents won't pack it, because then it'll only be wasted, and people can't afford to have that type of food waste. So that cost of not only building that lunchbox in terms of managing what children are consuming, but also the cost of food as well, that parents particularly perceive fruit and vegetables as being much more expensive. And so if children are not going to eat those foods, well, then they're not going to take the risk of having that come back in the lunchbox and come back home if it's not going to be eaten. So there's lots of different factors that are really influencing the types of foods that we're consuming. And what wasn't mentioned in this research, in the previous research, is the importance then of how we're being influenced, and particularly our children are being influenced by lots of different, particularly those treat foods, those top shelf types of foods. And sometimes it can be obvious how we're being marketed towards these types of foods, but in other instances, it can be much more implicit and subliminal type of marketing that our children are being they're tuned into this type of product placement, or maybe it's online. We're seeing an awful lot more of TikTok influencers now in terms of promoting certain types of food brands. So that marketing is everywhere. And we really need to be mindful of the fact that a lot of the food preferences that our children are making are bound to the strength of the marketing machine that is making this world that we live in a particular type of food choices. So in terms of how do we approach it, I mean, I suppose the most essential part of trying to encourage healthy lunch boxes is to try and help encourage the schools themselves to be a really supportive environment for healthy eating. And so if your school doesn't have a healthy eating policy, it can be a really useful starting point. So there's again some useful toolkits from the HSE, which are available, and that can be a start, particularly if you have a parents' council that may be able to encourage that process in building in a healthy eating policy. Again, these policies are very much there. The intention is not for any kind of judgment or parents being watched. The idea is to create an environment where all children recognize that it's normal to have an apple in your lunchbox, that it's normal to have a sandwich in your lunchbox. So it's trying to create that appetite where everybody is hopefully looking at the same types of healthy eating options provided in their lunch. And secondly, I just wanted to point out this, the idea of, as was mentioned in the research about, not only increasing healthy foods, but also thinking about, well, how do we manage food waste? And this is becoming a more important issue when we think about climate change and sustainability, and very much trying to look at that whole picture, because we can really look at health and sustainability together collectively. So we're seeing an awful lot more of this ideas of school lunchboxes as being an opportunity, not only for the health of our children, but to learn messages and lessons around food production and food waste, and the importance of valuing the food that we are being provided with as well. So I think we're going to be seeing an awful lot more of that around school lunches and healthy eating. And globally, we're seeing a huge amount of discussion around school food. In Ireland, we don't have a comprehensive school food program. We know that it is available in certain schools, but the idea from a global perspective is to try and make sure that every child has the option to have a healthy meal, and particularly for those that are experiencing some type of disadvantage, that healthy meals should be a standard across all schools, not only from a nutrition perspective, but also in terms of educational outcomes, and also trying to improve potentially sustainable development goals. So the final messages are basically, again, trying to encourage variety for your children, trying to expose them to new foods frequently, offering different types of foods at home, and making sure that your children are seeing you consume healthy foods and different types of foods. Making your children, make them involved, get them involved in the shopping, or whether it's preparing certain meals. But when it comes to their lunches, help them to choose, but set the boundaries. So you set the limits of what's allowable within a lunchbox. Making healthy eating positive. And I think that's where we have to avoid this idea that, eating healthily is a negative option. And we really need to try and build in that culture of healthy eating being positive. And this very much tries to support this, children are learning, and it's not all going to be perfect, but fundamentally you're laying down the foundations for healthy habits for life, particularly in school children. And also, if you haven't got one available in your school, maybe talk to your school about trying to implement a school food policy, and it just makes it easier for everybody concerned if everybody in the school is adhering to the same type of messaging. So there's a few resources and there's a few links here, different types of planners that we have available from Safe Food, from the Irish Heart Foundation, and they can be really useful guides and give you lots of different tips in terms of what types of foods to pack for your children's lunch boxes. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celine. That was a wonderful overview of school lunches, and with lots of messages and tips on how we can improve the lunch boxes of our kids. So Celine is going to be joined now for the Q&A session by Niamh and Sarah. And you, the audience, can place your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom.